All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the February LHI monthly call. This is Miranda Migueli, and here with me today is Claudia Johnson of Pro Bono Net as well, and Bart, Earle, and Marc Lauritsen of Capstone Practice Systems, and we thank you all for joining. So just wanted to remind attendees that this call will be recorded and made available in the LHI Resource Center at the link displayed, and I'll add this link to the chat box in a bit, along with other links displayed in the slides. So here's our agenda for today's call. We're going to start things off with some basic announcements, as well as an update on the progress with the rebuild project and rebuild transition-related issues we wanted to share with the community. Today's main call topic is managing unansweredness and same-answerness, and this portion of the call will be led by Marc and Bart of Capstone, and then we'll end with time for questions, comments, and discussion. So next, we just wanted to say congrats to partners who submitted LOIs for LSC's Pro Bono Innovation Fund that were due yesterday. And alert partners, if you're not already aware, that decisions for that funding stream will be announced April 1st, or decisions on LOIs to invite folks for full applications. And as you may have seen via the listservs, our experience, we are still receiving reports of performance issues, unfortunately, on LHI after we've increased HotDocs server capacity and updated the version of the HotDocs server. And as we continue to work with HotDocs Corporation to address these issues, we have instituted a schedule of 8 a.m. Eastern and 8 p.m. Eastern server reboots to free up resources on LHI and improve performance as we work on other approaches to the problem. And as you may have seen or participated in, LSC just gave a webinar on the LSC TIG application cycle. So letters of intent to apply for those are due March 20th. And you can get some more information on the application process link displayed. They've also recorded today's webinar, and that'll be made available on the LSC TIG site. Feel free, and we encourage you to reach out to myself or Claudia for ideas and support on LHI-related LOIs and TIG projects. We also have sample application materials and other resources in the LHI Resource Center, and we'll share a link on where to get that in the chat box in a bit. And then the next announcement we wanted to make is about the Equal Justice Conference, which is taking place in Austin, Texas in May. And more details are available there. Registration is open. Myself and some other Pro Bono Net staff will be attending, and we hope to see you there. So on rebuild, here's an updated timeline. Wanted to highlight that the second round of partner testing has been extended through the 28th, so that's this Friday. And we're now targeting March 14th, or the weekend of March 14th, for production deployment. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about where things stand, what we're working on. So we're working on doing our final priority bug fixes and enhancements. We've successfully completed and are now QAing the next round of data migration. So that basically means all the data that's in the current LHI environment or was in the current LHI environment as of early to mid-February is now in the MAR Labs environment. So we're QAing it there, and it will be available in the rebuild QA environment as well in the next day or two. Also, we'll do one final round of data migration, so we're doing this in incremental stages just so that we can QA it better, learning from lessons from the previous issues with data. And so the next data migration sort of dump of data is going to be the second week of March and just before conversion. We've implemented and tested load balancing for the new system so that our system can better handle user increase and has the capacity to more flexibly respond to increases in users. And we'll be paying special attention to that as we roll out to confirm that the system has enough horsepower to support growing usage. And again, the new The new target for moving to the new system is the weekend of March 14th. So LHI will be down Friday, March 13th at 6 p.m. Eastern and will be unavailable that weekend as we finalize and test the transition to the new system. And we'll be making announcements via the list, but wanted to just flag that here in this call. And on the next slide, there's just a few more items we wanted to flag. One, there may be a freeze on the current system to updates on user profile details, so that's would be a time period where we would notify users that any changes that are made to things like usernames, their states, and their passwords won't make it to the new system. So we'll have that confirmed by the end of the day and follow up via the list and via email to registered users. That's not going to affect new users or existing users without changes during this period, but just wanted to make folks aware of that potential data freeze period. Template uploads will be able to continue up until the weekend where the whole system will be down March 13th. And again, wanted to announce that code push weekend so folks are aware of it. And then some other rebuild-related items. LHI interview links won't change, so for folks with SWEB and Court and other partner sites with LHI links, you won't have to take any action before we transition to the new site. Widgets or widgetized interviews will have to change, and our widget partners have received messages about this and their next steps to ensure smooth transition to the new environment. Also, integration partners, our technical team has been in touch and will continue to work with them with final information about redirecting their systems to the appropriate rebuild, staging, and new production environments. So that's all I have for announcements. I think we're going to do questions at the end unless there's anything we want to discuss now. Otherwise, I'll turn things over to Bart or Marc. I don't know if Claudia, you have anything to add to the announcements?
No, I'm good. I just want to really emphasize to people that if they want to work on takes related to document assembly, to feel free to reach out to either of us. And we're here to help you figure out how to write those and help you with data or examples, etc.
Can you pass control to Bart? He'll be talking first.
I'll just take it.
Oh,
so
there you go.
I've got it. Okay, so Marc and I are going to talk about two things that are sort of flip sides of the same coin. And they're both issues that you need to address as template developer in order to make the user experience a smooth and friendly one. One is handling unanswered questions, questions that may not be answered in the interview because either the user deliberately ignores them or because they are in fact irrelevant. And then, which I'm going to discuss, and then Marc is going to talk about the flip side, which is the situation where the same information needs to be used in multiple places, and how do you make that experience smooth for the user so they don't get frustrated having to retype information. And he'll demonstrate for you an approach to sort of handling a common problem that comes up in that context. So when it comes to unanswered questions, a few design principles I think that everybody should follow in their interviews, and I know a lot of the folks on this call now have been doing this kind of work for a long, long time, so a lot of this may be kind of old hat, but maybe there's a gem or two in here. And I also have going to do a quick demo of some of these things with a little sneak peek at something that we're going to cover in depth in a future call, which is a new feature in HotDocs 11.1. So interview design principles, one kind of obvious one is to ask only relevant questions. And I guess that seems obvious, but I oftentimes see interviews where, for one reason or another, the way the interviews are designed, they do ask irrelevant questions. In other words, questions that don't apply to the user. And then that means that, number one, they're confronted with a question that they don't know how to answer, or they're going to leave blank, and then you have to handle it in the document. So you want to fully qualify the logic in your interviews so that only relevant questions get asked. If a question is only relevant when, under certain circumstances, pre-qualify the asking of that question with other questions that narrow down the scenario that you're dealing with. And you can do it with a scripted interview, or you can do it with what HotDocs calls a default interview. If you have fully qualified and correct logic in your template, HotDocs will generate an interview that is only asks relevant questions. Minimize the number and difficulty of the questions the user needs to answer, and this is more addressed to the issue that Marc is going to talk about, but the idea is don't overload the user if you can. Avoid it. And another principle is to take steps to encourage users to answer all essential questions. I know a lot of people force users to answer them, which is fine, but there also may be ways that you can encourage users to answer the questions. So some strategies for the interview. One thing you can do is default answers. Obviously, if an answer is almost always going to be, for example, in a multiple choice question, if a certain answer is going to be common, or if there is a checkbox that should almost always be checked for a true-false, then it makes sense to default it. The downside, of course, is that users might just accept the default and not realize that they need to make a change. But there are probably a lot of situations where you can use default. Require, I know, is very, very commonly used. Require in the dialog script forces the user to answer the question. They can't go any further. You can also, and this is really also well-known and essential technique, is to conditionally hide and show variables, either specifically with scripting in a dialog or letting HotDocs hide and show them for you. Another thing you can do is to use custom alerts, and there's a alert process that you could use as a user or as a developer, which has existed in HotDocs for a long time, which is to use additional text that displays under certain conditions, informing the user of a mistake they've made or something that they've missed. There's also a new feature in HotDocs 11.1, which is now on the production server and which I expect we'll also have on the rebuild when that goes live, which I'll demonstrate, which is actually kind of a combination of require and a custom alert. It's kind of a neat new feature. There's in HotDocs desktop, as a lot of folks on this call know, when a question is not answered in the interview, HotDocs by default will warn at the end of the interview when it's not answered, and we'll say there's a list of, it'll say there are 21 unanswered questions, and that feature is now present since HotDocs 11 server was introduced, and since we went live with it, it's now present on the LHI as well. So you need to deal with that. One of the ways you need to deal with it is that you don't want to tell the user that they have 21 unanswered questions if some of those questions don't really have to be answered. The typical example is a middle name or a middle initial. Some people don't have it. So you can specifically designate a particular variable as having doesn't have to be warned when it's unanswered. In other words, you can uncheck the warn when unanswered checkbox for that variable, and then the user won't be warned that that particular question is unanswered. There are some other scripting commands that you can use that are helpful to deal with unanswered questions, and I'll quickly demo these, but one of them is 0, which is a scripting function in HotDocs that you can pass a variable to, and it will return either the true value if it has a value, or if it's not answered, it will return a 0. You can value is similar. It returns sort of a default value if the variable has no answer. So it will return false, for example, for a true-false variable, which can be very useful under a lot of circumstances. There's also the answered function, which tests to see whether a variable is answered, and you can use that in your interview logic. You can also use it in a template to handle situations where a question may be unanswered. So when it comes to template design, the principles there are very similar. There's kind of parallel principles. One is that you should only insert relevant language unless you need to include irrelevant language because they're essentially placeholders to replicate a form. In other words, if you're developing a court form and the court expects to see a particular paragraph in the form, even though it may have blanks in it, then you obviously need to include it, but otherwise don't include it. It's really a lot easier on everybody concerned if it's not included. Also, you should use fully qualified logic around optional text, and that means logic that encapsulates the full relevance of that text. There are things you can do to get away with not doing that, but in my view, really you should use fully qualified logic. I think it makes for a lot more stable, easy to debug template, and just avoids some problems down the road. And to the extent possible, you should gracefully handle unanswered questions, and that means that, as you know, on LHI in HotDocs, when a document assembles, if a question is unanswered, it's going to produce underscores in the document, and sometimes that's fine. You know, if it's a form where it says, please list the names of your children, if any, and there's an underscore appears because there are no children, that's fine. But if there is logic in the template, which means that the logic is unresolved because there's an unanswered variable referenced in that logic, you're going to get an underscore that appears in the middle of the document someplace. So template strategies to implement these design principles. As I mentioned, the LHI default for unanswered variable placeholder is underscores, and it doesn't matter what you do in your component file settings as far as unanswered variables. That is going to be overridden on the server by the server setting, which is the unanswered variable placeholder as an underscore. The only way that you can override what the server is doing is to use unanswered placeholders specific to a variable, either a default for that variable or a field specific. You know, in one instance where the variable appears, you can use a different unanswered variable placeholder and have something appear other than the underscores. But you can't do that for logic. So logic you really have to pay close attention to and make sure that you're not inserting underscores all over the place in your documents where there should be nothing. If answered is also useful in the template. Value is useful in the template. Field format I mentioned. And unanswered text settings you can do for variables. Let me just jump over to a simple template that I created for demonstration purposes. So the way I started with this, it's kind of has all of the problems that arise when you don't deal with unanswered text in the document or unanswered variables. So the situation here is, the scenario that I created is, if the person has children and if the children live with somebody else, then this paragraph should be appearing. And they also need to list their expenses, and they may have some of these expenses and they may not have others. So they might pay rent and utilities, but they don't have cable, and they don't have a phone, they don't have a car, and can show you a couple of strategies for dealing with these. So let's do just test assembly quickly here and see what some of the issues are. Okay, so I'm the user. I'm encountered by this screen. First of all, it says, do you have children? I'll say, no, I don't have any children. And then I come to the next question was, do your children live with anyone other than you? Well, I don't have any children, so I leave that blank. And I don't have any children. I might put 0 here. List the person the children live with. I don't know how to answer that, so I'm not going to answer it. So then I come to the expenses, and I say, yeah, my rent is $500, and I pay $50 for the utilities. I don't have a car, I don't have a phone, and I don't have cable. So let me just save the answers as something here. We'll just call this demo test. Okay. So if I do a document preview, I've set my component file settings to use underscores as the placeholder. So I'm simulating what would happen on the server. I'm going to get underscores. Notice the underscore I've gotten here for my logic, and I've gotten underscores for these, and I've gotten underscores for total expenses, which is no good because, in fact, I do have some expenses, and they should have presented that total. So let me go back to my template here. Let me close this and go back to my template. So here, this is a place where I would say you want to have fully qualified logic. So I would want to say here, I would want to say, whoops. Here I would want to say that I don't want this to come in unless both the petitioner has children and the children live with others. So this would actually be the fully qualified logic. I've got both conditions here. And if I wanted to go a little bit further with this, because let's say I'm worried that the user might not answer one of these two questions, what I could do is I could use value here for both of them. And if I do that, then what's going to happen is that it's only going to be it's only going to put in the underscore. It's not going to put in the underscores because this is, if the user does not answer the questions, this is going to evaluate to false, and this is going to evaluate to false. So the result will be false, so nothing is going to appear in the document, which is really the result that I want. And I could use if answered. I could use I could test on the answered status of the variables. So I could say if answered petitioner has children, and petitioner has children, and answered petitioner children live with others, and children live without petitioner children live with others. I could use that. It's a little unwieldy to begin with. And secondly, if I'm using a default interview, in other words, I'm not scripting my interview, then HotDocs won't even ask either one of these questions, because when you use if answered, it immediately assumes it's irrelevant, and you have to force it to answer those questions somehow. So value really is probably the preferable. If you're going to do something here, value is the better choice. Now I've fully qualified that, and if I and the other problem, of course, is that my total expenses is not resolving because I'm left these things blank. So if I go to total expenses, I'll open that up. And my approach there, basically, is that instead of just totaling the amounts, which is going to add unanswered values to answered ones, and the result will be unanswered. If I do a test now, you'll see what I mean. So I've answered the rent, I've answered utilities, and I've left the other questions blank, and the result is an underscore because it's unanswered. On the other hand, if I'll comment this out, and I'll uncomment this, and I test this, whoops, I've made a mistake here somewhere.
Got your zeros in parentheses rather than the variable, Bart.
Oh, okay, you're right. All right, I'll do the rent and the utilities and 0 telephone amount. I'll do these.
While you're doing that, Bart, I guess I'll just mention that it's good to be reminded that in HotDocs, variables have both, like in the case of true-false variables, they can be true, false, or unanswered. So there's kind of this try-value logic that, if you're not aware of, can really throw you for a loop. So you have to be conscious that there are scenarios where the unansweredness of a variable is going to throw results that are unexpected.
So if I use 0, I get the result that I'm looking for, which is that even though I haven't answered a lot of these questions, when I test it, I actually get a value. So that's what I'm looking to do there. So those are a couple of different instances where you handle things in the template. So let's flip back to the interview. And let me go into my children dialog and go to the script here. So if I do a default interview here, which this is doing, because I put all these questions on the children dialog, and because I haven't set the component file settings to hide the information that I don't want asked because it's irrelevant, it's asking me all these questions. If I took these variables out of the dialog and I let HotDocs ask them individually, it would do pretty much what I want. One thing you can do if you don't want to use a scripted interview is to do automatically disable irrelevant variables and dialogues. And my preference is to always hide. I think most people do. So then if I do that and I do a test assemble, it asks me, do you have children? If I say yes, do your children live with anyone other than you? Yes. So it's automatically hiding and showing stuff for me. And this works really well in a very simple template. You don't have to script really. But when things get a little more complicated, or if you're using an interview-only template that launches assembly of other templates, this does not work because HotDocs doesn't know what questions to ask. So the solution there is to use a custom interview, which I've already created, and also to script the interview so that it hides and shows the questions that I want asked. And I could also require, I'm not going to demonstrate require, but I can also, well, let me demonstrate require. And then I'll show you the difference between require and a new feature that's new in HotDocs 11.1. Okay. Typo there. Okay. So if I test, again, now I've required this question here, which is, do your children live with anyone other than you? So if I'm an inattentive user and I don't notice the red question here, and I click next, I get a pop-up that says one or more questions in the children dialog are required and must be answered before you proceed. If I had a lot of questions in the dialog, then this question could be kind of difficult for the user to deal with, because then they have to go back and figure out which question is required, and that requires maybe some hand-holding. You got to help them out quite a bit. And I know some people will hide questions until they won't show a bunch of questions. They'll hide them until they're they'll show one question at a time, essentially, so that it kind of forces the user to look at the last question. But let's try something else. So I'm going to comment out the require. And here's this is new in HotDocs 11.1. So this is the new error text, which presents a specific message to the user. In addition to requiring the question, it also allows you to, as a developer, to present a specific message to the user that there's a particular question that requires their attention. So in this instance, if petitioner has children is not answered, this script here, set error text to, you must indicate whether you have children, will display a specific error message and force the user. It also acts as a require, so it forces the user to answer the question. So now if I do a test and I click, let me erase this answer. So it's actually, I haven't answered the question. It's actually presenting the warning to me up here already because I didn't answer the question. Then if I click next, it pops up and it gives my custom error message. You must indicate whether you have children. So this is sort of, if you want to require a question and you want to be able to direct the user specifically to the problem, what they have not answered, then this is kind of a neat new feature that allows you to do that. And I think better than require, at this point with this new feature, I would want to use this in place of require. The only thing, of course, is that the message appears here. I don't know of any way to prevent this from appearing until the user clicks next when they leave the dialog, but it is very effective. So, and that's just kind of a brief overview. There's obviously a lot more to this, but that's kind of a brief overview of approaches to handling unanswered questions. And I'm going to stop and hand the ball over to Marc so he can show you his piece.
Hey Bart, before I take control, how would you deal with the fact that cable, telephone, and car payments aren't answered as far as the blank lines in the document? You showed how you've dealt that with the expense computation, but if you wanted those non-answers to appear just as blank lines, what's the strategy for that?
Well, again, some kind of logic that would hide those lines in the in the document. So I mean, there are a variety of ways you can do it, and depending exactly what you want to do. If you don't want this, if you wanted this entire line not to appear, then you'd probably want to do something like, you know, if zero cable amount is greater than 0, or something like that. Whoops, I typed the if when I shouldn't have. So you could do something like that. If you didn't want a blank line to appear, if you just wanted this, if you wanted cable to appear, you know, this is a form, and you, for some reason you didn't want underscores, then what you could do, you could either put some kind of logic around this, or you could specify a unanswered text. You know, so you could put, you know, NA or something like that for the unanswered text, and then it's, you know, then NA would appear instead. So there's a whole bunch of different things you could do depending on exactly what the desired result is.
Good. I just wanted to bring that out for people because I think that may not have been obvious.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me take over. So, as Bart said, that was the easy stuff, and it's never quite as easy as it seems, even for us veterans. You get tied up in knots sometimes with unanswered variables and how to make a good experience. I'm going to talk about a related issue, as we said, which is when you've got a interview or a template that requires data where sometimes the answers to questions about one person or one thing are the same as the answers to the questions about another person or thing. And the most common example I've run into, which I'm going to illustrate, is addresses. And to show one way to attack that problem, many of you have dealt with situations where you've got multiple people in a matter and they're playing different roles. So for instance, in estate planning, you may have the same person being both a fiduciary and a beneficiary of a will. And there's long-standing techniques to do that where you've got kind of a common universe of people, and you can point to them in different contexts. I'm going to talk about a little bit different example, which is dealing with addresses. And I'll try to be as concrete as possible. The goal is you want to be able to spare users from having to retype the same information twice, if in fact it is exactly the same. And a side benefit, of course, is you also want to avoid any inconsistencies. So people, if they were to have to type things twice, might screw up and miss a letter or a number, and you'd get inadvertent errors or inconsistencies in the data. The challenges are you may have a number of different addresses to choose depending upon who else has been identified in a particular matter and who else's addresses have been entered. The user may proceed to enter that data out of the sequence you indicate, so you have to be kind of sequence independent. You'd ideally want the system to update addresses that have been identified as being the same as somebody else's where that somebody else's address changed. And this all requires some pretty complicated scripting. So in a recent project, I tackled this idea. I came up with a solution that works pretty well. It's still a work in progress, but I wanted to show it to you and see if it stimulates some ideas. So the basic approach is in this system, and I should mention this is a conservatorship system. Let me show this so it's a little more concrete. This is a California conservatorship petition, which can involve several dozen different documents, fee waivers, all kinds of petitions and attachments and special forms. We're working on a multi-county version of this guy that should be usable across a variety of different contexts with different local forms. And the way this looks as an interview in its current state, we are identifying a bunch of different parties. So this is a classic example, I think, where you have a universe of characters that are playing different roles, some of whom may in fact live at the same place and therefore should easily have the same address. So here we've got, naturally in a conservatorship, you've got a proposed conservatee, the person being conserved. And then in our system, at the moment, we have up to 3 proposed conservators. These, by the way, violate the usual rule against having repeated parties as separate variables, but there's only 3 of them, and this is something I inherited, so we're keeping it. But so you have a conservatee, 1, 2, or 3 proposed conservators. You may have a petitioner in the matter who could be one of the proposed conservators or somebody else, so they potentially get another role. Then you've got, for the proposed conservatee, you've got their permanent address and their current address, which may or may not be the same. And finally, you've got a whole roster of other relatives that all will have potentially their own addresses, and there could be as many as 10 or 20 of these people who are identified, when you deal with the extended family. So kind of a classic case of a lot of different people, a lot of different addresses, and how can we make this easy for the user and relatively consistent as far as the resulting data? So that's the challenge. Going back to my slides for a second. The strategy I'm following, which I'm going to explain in some detail, is for every address context in the system, for each potential role player, we have either one or several address fields, but we also have added a single field that's a list of other addresses in the system that you might want to say, oh yeah, it's this one, it's the same as that guy over there, and choose it. But that kind of multiple choice, of course, needs to be dynamic. It needs to respect which other addresses there are and to what extent they're different. Then if that address is chosen, if you choose one for a given person, you want logic to go ahead and actually populate that person's address with the one you've identified. So you've got a source and a target. And if the source address were to change, someone goes and fixes, grandma's address, and that's the one you said is the same as the proposed conservator, you want both of them to be synchronized. So that's the second aspect of the challenge to be taken on here. And then you want sometimes if somebody chooses an address and said, no, it's not really the same as that person, or it's no longer the same, they actually moved out last week and we want to update our data, you want them to be able to go back and change it. So let me show you quickly how this behaves presently, and then we'll get into the underlying componentry about how it was done and some of the design challenges behind it. So here we've got, again, we've got some identified parties. We then party by party, in this case the first proposed conservator, we have address fields, normal old address fields, in this case broken down by street, city, state, and zip. You may have, in some systems, multiple street addresses, separate address, a separate variable for apartment or unit number, but this is how it's done here. This here at the top is this new multiple choice that gives this person the ability to say, yeah, let's actually say this person has the same address as one of these other people that are identified elsewhere in here. And it turns out for our first proposed conservator, who is Jane, she doesn't have the same address as anybody. But if we go to Jim, who's the second proposed conservator, for Jim, we've chosen, oh yeah, he's the same as Alice, Alice being the proposed conservatee. So she's available in this list of addresses to choose from. Having chose it, it now is written into his record and has become uneditable. So this is the kind of effect you want. So if it turns out that Jim lives the same address as Alice, now this has been effectuated, and whatever Alice's address is in the system will be the same as Jim's. Now, if for some reason, like I say, Jim has moved, I'd like to be able to erase this answer. Upon erasing it, this then becomes editable, and I can now adjust or erase or change Jim's address. But should I wish to go back to what it was, it now is reset. So that's kind of the effect we want. Just to explain a little more of the complexity here, besides these proposed conservators and petitioner and conservatee, as I mentioned, we've got all these other relatives that need to be identified. Some are living, some are not. So here we have Jimmy. Now, in this system, all these other relatives' addresses are stored as a single field. So we have different granularities of address management in the same system. So we figured for these kinds of people, because of the requirements of the form, there's not a need to separately account for the street and the city and the state and the zip. We can do it all in one line. But we want to be able to choose from a somewhat bigger universe of potential addresses to choose from. Enough of that. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what the end result is, which I think is pretty useful right now, because we've now given the user the ability to only enter as many different addresses as they need to, and then for anybody that lists the same address to be able to choose a pre-existing one and have that automatically set and kept up to date. So how do we do it? That's my demonstration. I'll get back to some of the underlying componentry, but here's what you need. So in addition to the basic normal variables in something like Jim, let's look at Jane simpler. These normal variables, which you would always have for address parts, either all together or broken down as it is here. The idea is to introduce this new variable, this new multiple choice variable. So this here is in this case, it's a address to use for the first proposed conservator, MC, multiple choice. And this is dynamically populated. We don't know what the options are because the options are going to depend upon what other addresses exist in the system. So in order to make this work, you have to go and dynamically populate that multiple choice. And each one of these has to be specific to the context, right? Because the list of variables of addresses for the first proposed conservator is going to be different than the list of addresses for the second proposed conservator, because you don't want them to include their own address. So you have to have a script to populate them, and I think most people on this call have dealt with this before. Let me just bring up the scripts and make this clear. So in the interview computation for this system, which is controlling the flow of logic, the flow of questioning, at the very top I've got a computation called populate and manage copyable addresses. This is the component that does most of the magic here. And what it's doing is it's got 7 or 8 of these address to use dynamic multiple choice variables. These are the ones that appear at the top of each address block that will present other addresses in the system you might want to use for this person. So the logic here is in HotDocs you can clear a multiple choice and then you can add options to it. So what we do is we have this universe of variables that present the copyable addresses. We run this computation, we clear them to refresh it, so this is constantly being updated based upon answers that are currently in place. And then we go through each potential party, the conservatee, its current address, the conservatee's permanent address. And if in fact that particular person has an address that hasn't been cloned from somewhere else, we add their address to everybody else's potentially useful address. So it gets kind of hairy. There's a logic to it, but it's somewhat crazy to manage. So that's essentially the process to populate them. You clear them, and then you add for every context the address corresponding to that context if it's entered directly. That's the first part of the process. And as I'm talking, a lot of people are probably thinking, wow, this is really more trouble than it's worth, and that's up to you. It depends upon how many people use your template, how often, as to how much time you're saving them is justified in terms of you spending time. The other half of this is you also need a script that when somebody chooses one of those variables, it does the copying. So when I say that Jim is at the same address as Alice, and I choose her address here, it copies them and sets these to her address. And that is also done, and this call is recorded so people that want to go back and look at this can do so. That's done in the same computation. So this is the master computation that's constantly keeping track of all this stuff. And so just to show an example, so if in our entering of the current address for the proposed conservatee, CEE here, we chose somebody else's on that drop-down. Depending upon which one we chose, whether it was from the proposed conservator 1 or 2 or 3 or petitioner or whoever, we're going to set this context address to that source address. And so you need this kind of a if answered and set statements to do that as well. Finally, as you may notice, again, in an inherited system, we have great variety in the variable names. And this is a good reminder that when you are in charge of a template, if you standardize variables, you will find yourself losing less hair in situations like this, because we've got all different kinds of ways in this particular system of describing the names of the pieces of address for different parties, which make debugging kind of tricky. I'm going to try to get through this fast so we have a little time for questions. So that's part of, basically the mechanics are you create variables for these copyable addresses. You script it so they're dynamically populated with all the addresses that may be available to copy from. You need to have a script to actuate the user's choice of an address to copy. And then there's some interesting nuances. You want the actual option for these variables when you populate them to be something like the name of the party whose address you're copying, and you want to show the address as the prompt. So this is a concept some of you may be familiar with. When you populate a multiple choice variable in HotDocs, you can separately control what appears to the user to choose and what is actually stored as the value of the option behind the scenes. So in this case, we're seeing 500 CE Street, the full address of Alice Land, who happens to be proposed conservatee. Behind the scenes, what's actually being stored is the string CEC, current address of proposed conservatee. That's the option. And what's good about that is then, regardless of what the address may be at a given time, if we know that that's the one who's been chosen, that's the person whose address we can use. So that's an important concept. Will make more sense upon reflection, but you can separately control the option versus the prompt, and in this scheme it's important for the option to be some sort of a standard identifier of the party whose address you're choosing, not the particular address that used to be or is presently chosen. Secondly, you want in this kind of a system, if I had said Jim is the same as Alice, their current address, and I then later on came back and said, oh my God, it's really 50 CE Street, not 500. Now I want Jim's address to update even without me visiting that dialog. I shouldn't have to go back to Jim's dialog for that to change. And in order to do that, the logic that sets Jim's address to this address needs to happen outside of its dialog. And that's why it's happening in this computation that's running in the interview. So if I were to go back to Jim's dialog, you'll see automatically he's now got the same address, 50, and that's also the choice in the list. If I hadn't done it in the interview and I hadn't visited this dialog, my form may come out incorrectly with the outdated address for Jim because it hadn't caught up and done the synchronization. I already mentioned that in this particular system we have different combinations of granularities. We have some people whose addresses we gather in parts and some people whose addresses we gather in a single field. So you have to handle that variation. I've also presently set it up, just a preview of attractions if you try to do this. I've set it up so an address only becomes copyable if it's complete. So if I had, if I didn't have a complete address for my proposed conservatee, I just had put a street, but I hadn't yet done the city or state or zip, it wouldn't be available in the list for anybody to choose. It just makes the overall functioning a little cleaner. You could potentially have partial copying, but that gets even crazier. One nuance that I haven't done, because it's just a bunch of extra work that I think has little benefit, is if there are no addresses to copy, if I happen to have a case where I've only started to enter and there's only one address, it's not complete, you'd ideally want to hide this whole variable and not even show it. But to do that, you'd have to count how many addresses there are for each potential person it's a lot of extra overhead that's probably not worth it. And I think I already showed you how you can make variables uneditable when it's answered. So in the case of Jim again, once this has a value, these become editable. If this becomes unanswered, these then become re-editable. So in a nutshell, that may stimulate some ideas. I'll be happy to answer questions, but let me just quickly bring it to a close, and then we'll go to some questions. So I think I'm going to sing Bart's song here a bit, which is you have to, when you're doing responsible HotDocs development, both on the interview and the template side, you need to think about behavior when answers are not given, when they're missing or incomplete. And you don't want to bother users with questions they don't need to answer. You don't want to have forms acting inappropriately when things are accidentally or on purpose left unanswered. One thing to avoid, which is the other extreme, is requiring everything. If you require everything, it can be very frustrating. Sometimes people need to save their answer sets and go get answers, and if you don't let them exit without answering something, you prevent that behavior. Obviously, don't answer questions that are not necessary to be asked, especially now that the online environment will tell you all the time every single question you haven't answered. You can go to, if it's not obvious, go to a particular variable, and I won't bother showing you one. Let's go to our component manager. Just pick a random. On the Advanced tab, this is where you control whether it's warned when unanswered. If you uncheck this box because it doesn't need to be answered, that will then not produce that result. So you're not going to have users seeing all kinds of warnings that are concerned. And finally, consider some technique, something like mine, and I'm sure some of you have got some better ways to do it, where you can make it easy to adopt answers to other questions rather than having to retype. So let me stop, open for questions, toss it back to Bart, Miranda, Claudia, anyone who's got comments, and I guess we could have folks raise hands or whatever you want to do to see if there's any comments or questions.
Okay, right now everybody's muted on the call, but if
everybody's sleeping.
I see that we have some live ones. If anybody wants, you can raise your hand, or you can chat it. Okay, Gray, I'm gonna unmute you. I see you have a question. Okay, you're unmuted. Hello?
Gray, if you don't have audio, we can read it out. How does the warn if unanswered feature apply when the HotDocs template is assessed via A to J? Do we need to do something new in A to J?
I think the short answer there, and others can supplement, is if in fact you've got an A to J interview, you're never going to even trigger the warn if unanswered aspect of HotDocs, because that only applies to HotDocs interviews. So in the case of A to J, you're gathering data and you're just passing it directly to the HotDocs assembly process without any interviewing being shown at all.
And we have a comment from Sheila. Love the techniques. What fun. Thanks, Bart and Marc.
Okay. Always good to hear. It's also time for questions on the overall rebuild or any other general issues people may have. So Bob may have a question there.
I'm going to unmute you, Bob.
Hi, yes, I do. I have a question about the production server and the slowdowns that you've been experiencing. Recently, I had to work on an old interview created years ago by somebody else, and I found a number of references in scripts to components that no longer existed or didn't exist. So I cleaned all that stuff out, but I wonder if some of that stuff is going on the server because wasn't there a new bug in version 11 that where HotDocs interviews were troubled by non-existent references to non-existent components, even if the scripts weren't invoked?
Or you can probably most easily address that.
Yeah, but I guess one answer to that is that we've been on 11 for a while, so if that was the issue...
But haven't we been experiencing slowdowns for about the same period?
No. Well, what I understand is that the last 2-3 weeks we've suddenly experienced a lot of slowdowns. And so there's something new going on that without any change on the server that we're aware of. But I will say that problems with templates, errors that occur in templates can often, in the past, we've had situations where an error in a template basically would suck up HotDocs resources that did not get released.
Right.
And so if somebody had a reference to a variable that didn't exist, for example, and they, under a particular scenario, the user encountered that, so they would get an error message instead of a document. And one thing we found was that users were doing was that they were, they would refresh and get the document over and over and over again, and every time they did that, it was sucking up resources.
Increase the memory leak, right?
Yeah, and people actually managed to bring down the server by doing that like 30 times in a row. So the problem was the template, but also, the stubborn user who, didn't give up when they encountered the error. So I don't know. It's possible that there's similar things going on now, but there's something new because we have had. We've also had a lot of increased. It looks like increased usage suddenly, which is kind of mysterious.
All right. Okay. Let me look into something. I'll talk to you about something offline. So when we're tying everybody up here, I'll talk to you after this call.
Okay. Kathleen had some questions about the freeze that we mentioned. So Kathleen, I'm gonna unmute you. And this is related to the transition to the new infrastructure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. So we can continue uploading new stuff or edits to existing templates until end of the day on March 13th, and those will all come over and the move, and then stop until the morning of whatever that Monday is, March 18th. Is that what am I hearing that correctly?
Correct. So we'll be able to move because we're doing it incrementally. So we set it up so that you can continue to do template modifications, uploads, changes now through the 13th close of business. When LHI goes down that weekend, you won't be able to access this upload anyway. But on that Monday when we transition to the new system, anything you've done that Friday the 13th at 5:30 will be in the new system.
Got it. Okay, I just want to make sure I have that straight.
And we'll, it's a lot to remember, and then we have to work out a few more details with user profile information. So we will update the LHI Resource Center, and we'll send messages with this information via the list so you have it firmly. And of course, always feel free to reach out to myself or Claudio on it.
One bit of positive news to report is we had a load testing session end of last week, and we were doing a couple dozen interviews and assemblies simultaneously on the new server, and it just was purring away, delivering results pretty quickly. So there are some reasons to be encouraged, despite all the long drawn-out process of getting there. We think overall it's going to be a more stable, scalable, and better performing environment.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? And there's no stupid questions, so just feel free to ask. Okay. Okay, well, feel free to reach out at any point via email to Miranda or I, and we will keep the list updated on improvements we continue to do on the production system, and then on the rebuild. We're basically right now paying very close attention to make sure the system continues to function as best as it can before we move to the new platform. So stay tuned to the lists. And then for those of you who may consider doing LOIs for the new TIG funding round, feel free to reach out or look at the resources we have posted that may be helpful examples to pull funding to either improve or add to your collection or cover an area of law that maybe you haven't covered before through online forums for a particular type of audience. So just feel free to reach out on that too. And thank you all for joining us, and everything is going to be posted in the folder that we had shared before, and you can get the video and you'll be able to get the slides too from there to review these techniques, which I actually found very helpful myself, even though I'm not a developer like most of you. So thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Take care.